Good evening and welcome to H654. This is quite a late night lecture. It's already 11:30 here in Lindome, a little bit south of Gothenburg. We just had a lovely day, almost sunshine. Well, we saw the sun through the clouds and it was lovely. And then we saw the moon. It was up for a while. It's a lovely quarter-size moon. And when you think how the moon changes during the month, it comes to my mind to think about other changes. And one such change is something that Monica Krause written about. And she calls this change Zeitgeist. The name of the article, what is Zeitgeist? So, current research on culture rarely differentiates explicitly between period-specific and other kind of cultural patterns. And she wants us to look a little bit more at the temporal changes, not only the cultural changes. And you could actually say that zeitgeist, in her view, is a more temporal thing, whereas cultural patterns could be called localized or spatial. And zeitgeist means, when you look at the words of it, literally it means spirit of time in German. And its meaning is that of our life world. It's denominating a specific way at a specific moment in time. You can also name that an era or an epoch. And zeitgeist do, however, have more the meaning of some flow or some undercurrent, more than a specific start of an epoch and an end of an epoch. So the zeitgeist is more the flow in the epoch somehow. And when we used the zeitgeist, it could be explanatory, but it could also be some sort of pointer to something in this now. You can also say the way we reason now is because of the zeitgeist. And for instance, things I found for this era is a lot of sustainability. We think about the environment more than ever. It's very important what we eat and such stuff. And that's specific for this era. And it could also be called in some ways zeitgeist. I will try to look at zeitgeist in two rather different perspectives. And they cover a bit what both Krause wrote, and then she's quoting Mannheim quite a bit actually. She seemed to be fairly interested in Mannheim. And he's very interesting as well. But the two looks at zeitgeist will be very different indeed. But I warn you, the first one is quite long, so you have to wait a while until number 2 comes. And to get an understanding for zeitgeist, it's better to sort of give its characteristics in specific details. And since Kalle really wanted to have 72, which I here call the 60s, I will try to describe the most common way of talking about zeitgeist. I would say that it's the most common. And in this first one, it's a bit like a fashion. You can think about it like a fashion. We have our faiths and fashion, and the fashion in the 70s was flared jeans that was sticking out, but they were horribly tight for the rest. People often wear flowery t-shirts or shirts, and they had very big cuffs. That's very specific for the area. I think it's very hard to find any other epoch in time where the cuffs been that big, especially these things. And also the ties had a tendency to be rather big, almost looking like a scarf of some sort. And this is specific for this time era, but it's also a way of describing this first one of zeitgeist, something almost that you dress into. You get the feeling for it, and I come to think like you go to a Roomba party, you get into that feeling. You have a special dress, and you have the dance, you have the food, and you have the atmosphere, and you always get the sense like you are in some Caribbean world, life world or something like that. So that's first one is looking at the zeitgeist as a sort of costume. One thing that is so typical for just this era is liberalism and emancipation. And that starts exactly in 1965 in the United States, nowhere else. It's nice to have a specific date and year, and it starts actually with the civil rights movement. And I think that's a very good way at looking how it started, because that will also explain many things that signifies this era. And it's almost like in the United States, some absurdity that had been going on for a long while suddenly got discovered really, really clear. And there was this unfairness in the southern states of the United States, where black ones could not sit in the same bus, same chair, couldn't get the same job, had lower salary, and all that. So that was incredibly natural reasons to react. But you could say that reaction later spread to all other areas. So it became like a role model, either role model or cause, like instigator. It started the whole rest of the thing. Maybe this way of looking at things is not actually true, but it's still a very helpful way of presenting the whole thing. And it probably has some truth to it, because if you look at history, it wasn't so much of that thing before 1965 at all. But after that, it became like a general movement. And this is what zeitgeist is. So even if you had occasional things that could have looked like what happened in 1965 before, the zeitgeist started here. And a zeitgeist is not really like a cause and effect. It's more a feeling of something, and the feeling of similarity. And that feeling of similarity might produce similarities as well. So what happened is, during the 60s, it just went further and further. You got women's liberation, you get the liberations for other groups in society. I don't know all of them, but Mexicans, for instance, and immigrants of different eras. There also became some sort of emancipation of the different social classes. They intermingled, and all of a sudden it became very important to equalize how you dressed and how you addressed people. In Sweden, we took that a step further. We even tried to change language to make it more equal or something like that. They took away the polite way of addressing people, and because they wanted to have a more informal way. I think that might have been taking it a bit too far, a step too far. I don't think it was a good idea. But it goes to show exactly what the 60s, this era, was for. And I'd say it escalated. It started 65 and then it escalated. 68 was one of those tops. Then things really got heated with revolutions. Actually, proper revolutions would kill people and demonstrations and barricades and throwing of Molotov cocktails and violence and horrors and happiness, I don't know, all those stuff. We have to make a revolution, so a little bit of that feeling as well. A little bit of revolutionary feeling cast into it. And I think that maybe was a shocking contribution. One of the instigators, except for this explanation I had here now with the civil rights movement in the United States, that was a philosopher named Adorno. And they went to his university and made a sort of mini revolution and stormed the building and said, here we are the children of your philosophy, your revolutionary philosophy. And Paul Adorno almost had a cardiac arrest, and he said he wanted nothing to do with this. So it came almost like a surprise even to the people who wanted it to happen or wanted something to happen. It's fair to say. Something to happen, I would say, when it comes to Adorno. Or maybe he just was a little bit overwhelmed. But it was taken to further fields, more fields. So think of an expanding motion going into all areas. And of course, some of the things that are transponded are not quite obvious for us today. And that, I think, is a very important trait with the zeitgeist. It could be hard in some ways to understand how things are connected, because we left that zeitgeist. And you need the zeitgeist to understand what the zeitgeist is about. When you are in that time period, it makes sense to you. But some of the things have a little hard time making sense afterwards. And I think that's very characteristic, something that you should remember. It's almost a little bit like Thomas Kuhn, incommensurable, that it doesn't fit the other picture at all, like Newton and general relativity. One thing that didn't make sense today, it was taken to areas that seem to be a little outside this with emancipation. For instance, children should no longer be raised. This is the era when people said that children should be free, or maybe not even educated. And if they should be educated, they should be educated in a free way. Something in Sweden was called the free school. But similar things went on all over the place. And now it becomes a little harder to understand. The other things were quite easy for us, even in 2021, to understand. But this thing with the children, it doesn't seem to be fitting, because children is not a minority. You can get some sense that some idea of liberty or equality was transferred, but children are still children, not adults. And treating the children like adults, it's taking it a bit too far. But they must have their reasons. They have their reasons in their zeitgeist. It doesn't make any sense today. And that leads me into this really, really weird Rousseauan trait. The attraction of the noble savage. That was really evident in this time era. Not in the beginning, it came later. And what the connection is with this noble savage and the civil rights movement, I don't know, it doesn't make sense today, but that's typical. Those things you should find with the zeitgeist, because they only make sense within the zeitgeist when you are there. So people started with not only dressing down, but they also started to dressing off. I have friends who grew up with parents that were severely influenced from the 70s. I wasn't, thank God, I'm really happy for that. I have friends who have parents that were rumigated nuded in the house and even outside the house. And they entered in other people's houses and did things nobody even heard about before. That was also part of the emancipation. You should sort of spread your seeds all over the place. Maybe some connection to the noble savage, I don't know. But it was freedom, liberty, do whatever you want, little bit of that. And then you have this very interesting first look at taking care of the nature. There was some ingredients of the whole thing that going back to nature was better. And I see that as sort of a reaction at the technology that in that era really progressed very, very fast, much faster than before. Was the first of the accelerating movements in our time, and technology accelerated. And that happened many times later, but I think this was the very first time when it went really quick. You got computers, you got color TV, you got microwaves, you got more effective cars, and you got loads of different stuff. And also you got a considerably higher degree of wealth all over the world. There was a development in wealth, and that made it possible for you to go on other venues. You can go to festivals, but you can also feel a little more independent. And here we come to the more menacing traits in this. One thing was there should also be an equality of knowledge. And that was the first feeling I got when I was young, because this was still going on in my age. I'm 55. And I was like 10, 12 years when it started to end, the whole process. But you could still feel it, and especially since the teaching material you received in school always was like 5, 6 years behind for obvious reasons. You could read about it. But it was this about knowledge. All knowledge was equal. So they wanted to equalize knowledge. So it shouldn't matter what sort of knowledge you have. And this, of course, was the reason for the book of Bloom's book, Closing of the American Mind. It's a reaction to this era because it continued in education after the 60s and 70s ended. And one thing was getting rid of all the canonical knowledge. Every knowledge was equal, so why bother with complicated and hard stuff that has no connection to now? That's how they saw it. So why read Shakespeare? Why read the things from antiquity? And there was even a movie a couple of years ago called Dead Poets Society that illustrates that. It is, however, not set in the 70s. But I say it's about the 70s still. It's this revolutionary era, and the revolution in the movie is actually against the Western canon. What is important in literature, and almost a sort of idea that is not important somehow. It's boring and doesn't give you anything. It's dead poetry. I think that's extremely interesting. Yes, if you see the movie or read the book, it's set in the late 50s, but it's obviously the 60s. And another really good example is the movie series or television series, it became a movie too, called MASH, M-A-S-H. And I would think that is the most characteristic movie or series of the era in all categories. And it's one of the big heroes of that era, Alan Alda. Intellectual, Jewish, very, very liberal. East Coast. And MASH was also set in the 50s, but everything that was in MASH was about the 70s. I think that's interesting. It felt, if you put the whole TV series in the 50s, you can add even more of the 70s stuff. But it was all about liberation. The colonel, who was really popular, he didn't even dress. I think he had a fishing hat instead of an army cap, and was all these things. And one of the male nurses, she was a transgender dresser. They were having all sorts of personal problems, which took like a center part instead of the interaction between the characters. And it was also one major who was the bad guy. He was the old times guy. So he was always perceived as being bad. And I think one of the most typical thing with this era, it likes to demonize the old era in a specific way, which is typical of the 70s, I said. The man, it was called in America, the man, to fight the man. And even today, there's a festival called The Man, where you still to this day build the man in wood in the desert, usually a very big man, and then you have a party around the man and you take drugs. So it's very much the 70s, the hippie era. And what do you do finally with a man? Well, you set him ablaze. So I think that's rather typical for that era. And of course, this is when I should say, Sweden did not really took this era in all its aspects. It was just some aspect that came into Sweden. Not all of them. We were still at that time more outside of Europe. We had a Swedish variety of the student revolution, where the student club was occupied, violently occupied, and they were screaming outside the windows and were throwing rocks. But since this is Sweden, it turned out to be all staged by the government. That's very different from what happened in the other countries. It was a little bit like the government wanted to have a student revolution as well. They didn't find the students were willing to make a revolution, so why not encourage them or even pay them to make a little revolution? Even Sweden can participate in this zeitgeist. I think that's quite charming actually. We are charming people in some ways. It's quite innocent to have a stage student revolution. And of course that also helps with the problem of violence and that stuff. The police were told not to be too violent. They should look a little bit angry, not too angry. So it all passed very quietly, and after the occupation they set a date when the occupation should have terminated. and the police pretended to storm the building, and the students went home for tea and cake, maybe, or something like that. It was not like that in Paris or the other cities where they had this Berlin, some student revolution, and I think somebody told me that the student revolution in, I think it was in Amsterdam, was specifically violent. Violence seemed to be a part of it. But is this equalization of knowledge, which is quite interesting, and I think that took a really progressive turn in this era, because all knowledge was the same, so there was no specific use to concentrate on the canon, the base of the knowledge we had for hundreds of years. Instead, any knowledge had the same value, they were of equal value. And this is one of the leading words. Everything is of equal value. So that was true of knowledge, but then came another word, culture. All cultures are the same value. And they sort of extended the meaning of the word culture. First internally in the nation, inside the country. So they started to say the culture of playing rugby or something like that is of equal worth as acting in a play of Molière or singing the lead aria in some Bach piece. They were equal, and I learned still in my old culture how the same. But this is saying everything is of equal value. It feels today what they said, actually there is no value at all, because everything with the same value means no value at all. But culture also spread outside the country, and all of a sudden theatre or Swedish culture could be replaced with any other culture. They were like sort of units that were interchangeable. They were all the same somehow. And we can see such bit odd things like having an African Christmas, because that was of equal value. And if you have an African Christmas, you learn a bit more about Africa. It's a bit naive. All the other knowledge or the tradition, history, the thinking, you don't get that by copying African Christmas celebration. But it was a time of the zeitgeist as well. Naivety is a very, very dominating trait in the 70s, I'd say. Many people said that afterwards. We were so naive. We were like innocent children, but we really believed in something. And there you have the magnificent, fantastic, greater than life festival, Woodstock. That is the high point of this era. And it did a lot of good work as well, putting so many artists together, and everything was incredibly peaceful. It organized itself. And that was actually one of the ideas. Organization should come from the people. So it had many good traits as well. People should meet each other, should talk to each other, should relate to each other, they should sit next to each other, do things together. In Sweden it was incredibly popular to create collectives where you moved in together, and you were not living in a family anymore, you were living 4 or 5 people or 6 or 7 people. Maybe some singles, some couples, and then families with children. They all lived together. And this was this sense of collectiveness, get-togetherness. And that was the positive feeling I remember from my childhood, this collectiveness. Do things together, enjoy things together, open up to other people. But if I should pinpoint maybe one negative tendency, that was the tendency to making everything of equal and equally high value. And that idea, I think it was really obvious for us living in the time afterwards, that made everything not worth anything. And even today, the word culture in Swedish had lost a lot of its ordinary meaning that it has before the 60s. It became overused or generalized in a way that I think eroded its meaning. Was like overused, like you can overuse maybe a piece of land so it won't yield anymore. And I also want to mention, and this more from the text of Krause, there's a second take on zeitgeist. And this is a more Heideggerian understanding of the zeitgeist. So the first thing I mention here is almost like I'm standing here and I am able to describe the zeitgeist of the 70s. So we can understand, and I transfer that information to you listening. But the second take on the zeitgeist, it's even more like Thomas Kuhn. It's more incommensurable. And that means that it could be that the understanding we have of that zeitgeist is not correct, it's a completely different light world. And it's interesting in a way, because that means that most of the meanings you get in your life could be dependent on the zeitgeist you live in, especially the most important. And that means you are defined by the zeitgeist. And this is what Heidegger means, I think, my opinion, with Das Man, that you are the zeitgeist. That is you. So you're not outside it. And that's a bit stronger than the first variety, where you can describe it. Heidegger would have said you cannot describe it. If he would have talk about the 60s, he would say you can't describe it, because you have to be in it, you have to live it. Almost like only a carpenter knows about carpentry. You have to do it, otherwise the other thing would just be an
ornament.
Yeah, something on the outside, some explanation, and it doesn't have the true meaning, because that can only experience show. And that's quite interesting, because this makes very much of the substance in Heideggerian thought, his idea of Geschichte and history, that you actually are your history in a certain way. You are thrown into the world, yes, a spatial, but you are also thrown into a temporal time in the world. And you are part of that. You can't separate you from that. And we can see some traits. I can say it was really odd that the way they were wearing the pants sticking out extremely much, that was really odd. But I would, in this second case I mentioned of this more Heideggerian case, I would make a mistake, because I am not in that era. Therefore I can't understand why it was like this. Not even this I could understand, because it makes only sense in that temporal unit. And this was what Heidegger meant. And he had his problem with this idea of the origo we mentioned before. He didn't like the idea of it could be an inertial frame of reference. And the inertial frame of reference is needed if you want to understand something else to the fullest, like put it into coordinate system, make it localized, make it understandable for you. But hey, if there is no origo, if that all is a myth, well, I won't say anything about that because that's another lecture I already did, and I'll probably make one more. But think about it. What would it mean not being able to understand one's own era, or not even other eras? That could also be a meaning of zeitgeist. And I don't want to say you're locked inside the zeitgeist. This is not something terrible. And Heidegger definitely didn't mean it was something bad. It just sounds bad in our fixation with the origin and the objective. Actually, I think Heidegger said that's good stuff. To be in the zeitgeist is to be alive somehow, to be with the flow. And there's no other way to go. Maybe if I should make up a metaphor for Heidegger here on the double where I'm standing, it would be like saying, if you want to have the fun, you have to go to the Tivoli, the amusement park. And if you don't go, you're outside, you're another zeitgeist. There could be a comparison. And then you can talk to your friends who went to the amusement park, and you can ask them, and they could say so. Yeah, we like that one, we like that one. This doesn't mean at all that you have any experience of how it was. You weren't there. And if they could transfer anything of that experience to you, in the end nobody will go to the amusement park. But of course this is complete nonsense. Nobody can tell you how the experience was. And this is what life is. It should be that way. It can't be any other way, and it's not a negative thing. But I have to point, Mannheim in the paper goes a little further in that direction than Krause herself does. It seems that Krause, she is leaning more to the descriptive idea, that you can actually describe it. And she's using words here like culture, which is very common, it's typically for the era, but it's also a good tool. But then she's talking about fashion, she's talking about paradigm, and all those areas are fantastically interesting. It is a paradigm. Of course, the 70s was a paradigm. Our time is a paradigm as well. And then she has the word ideology. And I'd say the first description I made, there you have the zeitgeist more like an ideology, whereas paradigm corresponds more to the second example I made. So, to conclude the whole thing, I'd say that zeitgeist as a concept do have some sort of a variance in itself. So even the concept is not 100% fixed, but then it could also refer to different things, like these two things I mentioned now. Yes, it could be actually a third or the fourth alternative. But Mannheim, he identifies two zeitgeists as well, and they, at least the first one is similar to the one of the two he describes. I think it goes for a very interesting thinking. Why should it be so horrible to be locked in a time era? Heidegger didn't think it. And I don't think the people who lived in the 70s were like, oh, how awful to be stuck in this era. I think it goes for some naivety, and I heard a lot of those naivety people say, oh, horrible to live in the Middle Ages. It's like you can jump out on your own life world somehow, and I think that's going into the wrong direction. It's not wrong in all aspects, but it's definitely going in the wrong direction. Somewhere there's a confusing area popping. A third aspect could be just an add-on, is those popular descriptions of the era, the 60s and the 70s. When the generation grew up, we even had the 70s show. I think it's very interesting. And that's nostalgia for that time era, where you can recognize the zeitgeist, not only the dresses, but also the free sex, the liberal ideas, the naivety and the happiness and the collectiveness, all those things that people who grew up in the 70s remember as a good thing, and they want to be nostalgic. And they get a good portion of that in these years. And that's my first alternative there, where you can be partly outside. And you can look at it and you can laugh at it. And I think both things go. You can have complete lockdown in the zeitgeist, but you can also look at it and laugh, enjoy it. I think they're actually two different things, two explicit things of the same implicit thing, I would say. So you can do both things at the same time. You can laugh at it and still have it implicitly in yourself. It doesn't have to be only one and the other. So I think I round up here. I just want to say that I find both Krause and Mannheim quite intriguing. And I say thank you to Kalle to introduce me to the text. And I hope you have some good use for my little thing here about the 70s. And well, it's my era, so you're welcome to ask me, this old guy, how the 70s were. No, I wouldn't say I know anything. I just know the ending part of it. And I say, yeah, really good night, over and out from Lindom, Sweden. Thank you.
Thank you so much.